You're listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. This week, I sit down with Erin, the owner of Hermit and The Moon, to discuss the alchemy of language within the framework of tarot. Erin is the owner of Hermit and The Moon and has been reading tarot for most of her life. She began getting curious about the tarot over 25 years ago in her late teens, and the relationship has blossomed over time. Reading tarot from a soul-guided perspective is where Erin's wisdom really shines. She prides herself on channeling readings from a heart-centered space and offers compassionate counsel for those who are looking for guidance around trusting their own innate wisdom. Erin considers the cards to be a mirror, always reflecting back to us what we may need in each present moment. Hey, Erin.
Hey, Shannon.
So I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today because you're someone whose path I've crossed, well, a few times, obviously on social media and stuff, but you were actually a member in the Symposium and you made such an impression on me. So when we kind of reconnected recently, I was really excited to kind of touch base and chat because we had this meetup. And I don't remember exactly what the topic was. Maybe you remember. It's okay if you don't. But there was a term that came up, and the term was Stalker Card. And you did such a good job assertively, but gently explaining how using that phrase can be considered insensitive and actually make light of a form of violence. And you ended up sharing, I think it was a personal anecdote or about a friend of yours, I think. You might need to correct me on that. But
yes, it was.
Okay. So it just really stuck with me. And from that point, I don't use that phrase anymore. Instead, I say repeating cards. And just I felt so shitty because I try to be so careful with language. And, that phrase Stalker Card is so commonly used in the tarot community that I just didn't even think to question it until you brought it up, which then when I reflected on it, felt really shitty. But so when we reconnected and we started chatting, I was like, that we have to talk about this in the podcast. So I appreciate you being willing to come on and have that conversation with me.
Absolutely. I feel like language is such an incredibly nuanced kind of topic. And in the tarot world, like you said, I think there's definitely times when folks just kind of catch on to a term or, something along those lines. And it's not even thought about in any other way because so many folks are using it, right? So I definitely agree that it's nuanced and also nothing to feel bad about. I feel like we're all learning and that's, part of our experience. But for me, that term also kind of in some ways perpetuates that stereotype that tarot is like scary or somehow after you or going to do something to you. And for me, so it was kind of twofold, right? Like this using that language kind of felt twofold where it was like, both a little insensitive or a lot insensitive, to be honest, for, the use of that term stalker when there are folks who really struggle and suffer not having sort of freedom and liberation in their lives because they may have an actual stalker. Mm-hmm. And then there's the piece with tarot where it feels like tarot to me is an absolutely benevolent tool. All of the cards have medicine. All of them have something to sort of bring to us, teach us, but they're certainly not after us or they don't have a malicious kind of context in my experience. So I kind of feel like twofold that wording just didn't really resonate for me. So yeah, I don't remember the topic of the meetup, but I absolutely love how much it affected you because I felt the same way when it kind of came up for me, where it was just like, oh my gosh, it's like something about language and how it can just blow open the doors, right? And that's what I mean about learning, those of us that are kind of the perpetual page energy, sort of always learning. And I think anyone who, is involved in tarot is always learning, just because the tarot has so much to teach, right? So yeah, I mean, we're learning at the pace that we learn at. And I think it's really beautiful that really touched you and affected you and me as well. And I hope that ripples out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, how can it not? And I love that you brought up the twofold aspect, because that's actually something that kind of came on later for me after we had that discussion. And I was like, yeah, I need to be like really careful with the language that I'm using, because I definitely want to be more, I want to have that trauma-informed approach with the cards in the same way that I do with my clients. And so I definitely had that initial reaction. And I love that you brought up not perpetuating this stereotype that tarot is after us, because that's exactly what I was thinking later on, is like, well, it also has this just negative connotation with the cards. And we know that language and words already have this really profound effect on us and how we think and how we feel and how we behave. And then also how we connect or disconnect with each other, which again, language brought us together, which I think is really cool.
I love it. I love that.
So, I mean, and yeah, to go back to the trauma-informed thing, that's something that a lot of folks talk about, trying to exist within that trauma-informed space. And I feel like language is really at the root of that, because using trauma-informed language or being trauma-informed is having an understanding of the words that we choose and how they can affect us or the people around us, and how those words can either promote healing and empowerment or promote disempowerment. So
true.
Yeah, there's a lot happening. And of course, to go back to tarot, like language affects how we view and see the cards.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and it boils down to kind of, I feel like trauma-informed reading is something I try, it's a value that I hold like in a very high regard when it comes to my offerings in general, and using the tarot, especially with folks I don't know, and I don't know their story and I don't know their history. If they come to me in a setting that, I'm just meeting them for the first time, it is, like I said, it's kind of, there's nothing to feel bad about, because I know that I'm holding this as a value for me. And so I do understand that, kind of what you're mentioning sounds like, what impact might we have, right? Yes. And if we walked around so hypervigilant around saying the wrong thing all the time, we're not being people, right? Like,
absolutely.
But also to be able to be called in, like you said, kind of when my approach was to call folks in, not to point someone out or, make sure that they know they're doing something wrong. It was more like, hey, have you considered, right? Like how that word or terminology might affect other folks who've suffered from the effects of, living with a stalker, right?
Yeah. And using the phrase inviting in. And then you said something a moment ago about, just not knowing someone's story, for example, when you're giving a reading or they're engaging with your offerings. And what's a way to even be trauma informed or be careful with your language is, again, you don't want to be walking around like in your head going, oh my God, I'm going to say the wrong thing all the time. It's using that phrase that you said, inviting people in. So if you're giving someone a reading and they don't necessarily resonate with the language that's used on the card, you can always say, here's what the traditional meaning of the card is. But if you were to change the language on this card, what feels right to you? And then you could work together with that person to come up with the language or terminology that fits within their kind of frame of reference and the lens through which they're experiencing the world.
I love that. I mean, that's really bringing up, I pulled a few cards before the episode, and one of them was the 3 of Cups. And in this particular deck, it's the 3 of Vessels. So again, language has been changed. Vessels are multifaceted, right? They're not just only a cup. So I kind of love that. And also that sort of collaborative kind of 3s of the tarot energy that you're kind of speaking to, like the reader, the querent, and the deck, right? There's like 3 there coming together. And I love how that kind of resonates for where this like 3 of vessels is sitting on my table. So very interesting.
I love that you brought in the number 3. That feels so fitting for what we're talking about too, because there's so much context, and like you used the word nuance earlier, so much of that. And I feel like 3 is a good number to represent that. And I love that you already brought up a card. So it kind of makes me want to like already maybe shuffle and start pulling. Do you want to pull a card?
I would love that. Yeah.
Awesome. And I figured because we're talking about language, it was only appropriate to use a deck that doesn't adhere to traditional tarot language. So I'm using the Rainbow Moon Tarot. And actually, I don't think I've used this deck on the podcast yet. So that's exciting. Awesome. What are you using?
That is exciting. So I have 4 different decks here in front of me because I do have quite a collection. And the ones that I really was centering on, kind of like you, are ones where the languaging has been sort of mindfully reconsidered, right? So I have in front of me Slow Holler, which is a collaborative deck, also interesting with the 3s. I love that it's also a collaboration just amongst the cards and different artists. They're all Southern queer artists. It's a gorgeous deck. Also out of print and hard to find. So I'm very sorry to even bring it up.
I know
people are going to go looking for it and it is impossible. So just don't.
I already did when we talked about it.
I know. I'm sorry. And it's a really aggressively hard one to find. It's one of the hardest. So I can tell you that story another time about how I acquired it. But I have that one out that I did some pulling kind of before our episode. But the one I'm going to use now is actually Outsider Tarot.
Okay.
By Bobby. I think it's pronounced Abate or Abati. It's Abate. Also lots of language changing in this one. So I'm excited to see what comes up and share some language with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
For sure. What did you pull?
So I pulled the Chancellor of Cups, which correlates to the Queen of Cups.
Ooh, interesting word. Ooh, interesting. Okay.
What'd you get?
So I got the Root of Eyes.
Ooh, the root. What does that translate to?
So that is the King of Swords, which is very interesting.
Okay. So, and I feel like this is going to be so meta. I feel like we're going to be having like a conversation within a conversation now because
totally
one of the other components here is once you learn tarot and then you get a deck where the language is totally different. It's like having to relearn it all over again. So yours is a little bit more complicated. I feel like the Chancellor of Cups is a little bit easier because you can probably, discern what they're talking about. But I appreciate the Rainbow Moon Tarot's depiction because their whole deck is really gender inclusive. So you don't see gendered language like king or queen. In this deck, it's Chancellor and Warden as queen and king traditionally. So,
okay.
Yeah. But I mean,
those are interesting words.
Yeah, I know. I feel okay about Chancellor. Warden kind of gives me different vibes where I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that.
Right.
Because I immediately think of like the warden of a jail.
Exactly.
Prison.
That's what it comes to mind for me too.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I guess it could be a king kind of energy though. I mean,
yeah. I don't know if it's like, I don't know. Maybe that's my own stuff. Maybe not positive king energy. But I feel like Chancellor's a little bit better. But I like that it's not gendered though, because when you think of Queen of Cups, you think of this, you think of the emotions card, and that automatically has this highly like feminine energy to it, especially because it's an emotionally charged card. And so when you automatically associate feelings energy to be inherent within the Queen of Cups, I feel like it cuts off a lot of people to be able to connect with that. And it can be maybe even disempowering to like masculine energy. And I don't even mean that in a gendered way, because I feel like, I don't know, as a society, we've been taught to gatekeep emotions and emotional experiences.
Absolutely.
So yeah, like how only certain emotions are acceptable based on your gender, and that's like super polarizing and harmful. So yeah, to see the Chancellor of Cups is kind of cool because anyone can be a Chancellor of Cups.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So in that way, I appreciate that language of choice. And honestly, interesting that was the first card that I pulled, because I feel like this topic of language can also be really emotionally charged, which we didn't really talk about in the beginning. But there are a lot of emotions tied up into this, not necessarily just wanting to say the right thing to not harm anybody, but also the emotional impact that words have on us and other people.
Absolutely. Well, and even just the emotional impact that they have when we feel like we've made a mistake, right? Or said the wrong thing.
Absolutely.
Kind of like we talked about when, even when you were saying, oh, I felt bad I had been using that. And it's like, also you learned, right? I mean, this is part of being a person is making mistakes. And, it's something we don't hold a lot of space for in this current climate. Mistakes are like part of being a person. And I feel like discussing that in the realm of kind of language, when we learn better, we sort of do better and make a change. And so I also love, I feel like that's kind of for me and my experience with tarot decks that sort of change it up. It's often found in the court cards, especially with kind of more modern decks that are kind of taking sort of gender out of it. And also like, just that's not absolutely relatable.
Yeah.
Page, knight, queen, king. We don't come across those every day in our lives.
Right. So, not anymore.
But, not so much. So I do think it's, that's kind of the direction a lot of people have gone. And, I love thinking of the kings as roots, as a root system, in this root of eyes. Like, wow. I mean, it really conjures this kind of totally different experience, like you said, from if I had said, oh, I got the King of Swords, right? Like really different. But also there's some kind of focus there on almost like, I don't know, the eyes part is interesting too, because that's where they've changed the suit of swords to eyes. So making that connection is really like, it's a challenge for me as a person who has read tarot for a long time. Like eyes and swords, how does this connect?
Yeah.
But I really love the root piece. I feel like that is kind of something that we can connect with others. We can feel really sort of rooted in our sort of confidence, in our knowing. Like that makes a lot of sense to me, to switch out king for roots.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So when you originally pulled that card, when I was like, oh man, this is going to be like a conversation within a conversation, because now I'm focused on that imagery. And I feel like now it's like, yeah, eyes is a big deal.
What does it all mean?
I know.
Definitely.
I'm like, can we talk about that? But I love that it's called Root of Eyes. Is that what it is?
Correct. It is.
So I just sifted through, because I knew that there was a card in the Rainbow Moon Tarot that used the term root, and I couldn't remember what it was, but I found it.
Okay.
And it's called rooted. So it's actually represents the Hermit. So interesting that both the decks we chose had this term with the word root in it. And I do think like that offers us this, I don't know, maybe like subtle shift in interpretation or perspective, because like you said, like kind of grounded and just really rooted. And I feel like it's not only, well, I guess now that I'm thinking about it in terms of the Hermit, but also with the King, you can look at it as not only representing, the traditional like solitude or introspection as the Hermit does, but an emphasis on a connection with yourself and the people or things around you. Because there's this, I wish I knew exactly where I read this, but there's probably plenty of articles out there that talk about how like resilient and communicative trees are. And I feel like this is going to sound weird, but okay, you know where I'm going.
It does not sound weird.
Cool. They're complex rooting. Yeah, they have this like really complex rooting system. And it's really cool because it's a form of communication, which honestly really makes sense now with your king, because
Absolutely.
swords are typically about intellectualizing and communication. And so when we think about being rooted, it's like the trees, for example, their communication, their roots are a way to look out for other trees, and they like will help each other out and like give each other nutrients. So it's really fascinating to hear this word root in two different decks used with the major arcana and then with one of the court cards.
Yes.
You know, two very different cards, but a really beautiful form of this like verbal alchemy that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Also, I have to mention, just because of your background, the little piece in the guidebook for this deck sort of describes the imagery, which I just have to do. But
yeah.
It says the elemental known as the root of eyes brings earthly grounding and stability to the mental realm of air, which I love. And the imagery on it is a cloud of smoke rising from the iconic tobacco pipe of influential psychiatrist Carl Jung, which I thought you would just be delighted by for sure.
I am. That's beautiful.
Yeah. So I love that kind of grounding feeling, because that's not usually what I would associate necessarily with swords, you know? So I kind of love how bringing in the root kind of grounds that otherwise potentially pokey energy that can happen with swords.
Yeah. And that whole deck. So root would be for every king in that deck.
Correct. Yep.
Which is really
cool. And then
cool.
Eyes are the swords. Yeah, it is cool.
Because if you think about it, it's kind of inviting you to look at the energy of each king and how you can maybe feel more grounded in that energy. So it's like, it's almost like saying, okay, here's, you know, the king of, you know, wands or cups or pentacles, but, you know, in what ways are you rooted in this, or in what ways are you actively trying to become rooted in this energy?
Oh, I love that. I also love that this sort of shifts, like, you know, we talked about this being, you know, the intention to sort of ungender the tarot, and that this is like so effective, right? And also even sometimes things that come up around the kings for me, like confidence, has almost like a linear or masculine like connotation, just from what we've kind of been conditioned. So, and also how women in general, you know, who show confidence, it's different, right? It's received differently. It's, you know, it's kind of,
I love it.
There's a lot to unpack with that. For sure.
Yeah. I mean, you're making me think about a lot right now. I mean, you bringing up the word confidence is really fascinating, because now I'm having a reaction to the concept of this word rooted, and thinking that it's really representing a sense of humbleness now that maybe you wouldn't necessarily feel if you pull a king.
Absolutely.
Because, yeah. And there's this like, especially like going back to, how, you know, using the tree example, how their root systems are so complex and how they communicate. There's, you know, such a sense of like humbleness to just Mother Nature. And, you know, kings can be, you know, sometimes when you pull them, you can feel like just a sense of ego. And so to immediately, to immediately see a word root instead, I feel like takes away any of that maybe inherent power differential or ego you feel in the card.
I absolutely agree. I feel like it's such an effective change. I mean, I know other decks have done this kind of changing of the court names, and sometimes they do like family, right? Where it's like daughter, son, mother, father, which to me doesn't work great. I mean, depends on the deck, but I don't love it, because also then again, you know, the way that we talk about family and these different roles in the family. And I mean, that can be really not trauma informed, right? If you're like walking around using a deck that has, you know, mother, father in there, and someone has had, you know, an experience with one of those folks in their life that, you know, is just not great for like a tarot reading out at a bar, for example.
Right.
Like, we don't need to go there and bring up all of those issues, right? So
you pull the Dad of Swords and now you're sobbing at the bar.
Right. And you're like, oh God, sorry. I mean, I'm definitely the kind of reader that gives it to people straight, even if I am in a bar, but I mean, I do think that languaging even, right? Where it's like seems relatively like safe and understandable doesn't always work for me in the same way as something like this does, where it really, and I also love how it brings in nature, like you're saying, with trees. I mean, it's a really different experience than just the humanity of it, right?
Yeah. And, now that we're talking about like kind of the language that's present in other decks and how, especially, how they use the core card, that's usually the core cards are what they normally change the most. I'm thinking about how those of us who have multiple decks, especially more modern, non-traditional ones, it's not that the language is bad, but you can also decide, okay, maybe that's the energy that I need for how I'm feeling right now. So I am going to grab that. Or actually, I don't want this type of language. I'm just going to stick to my traditional deck. So I think that's where, the importance of having options and so many different possibilities to choose from are important.
I agree. I mean, it's not a one size fits all world, right? I mean, everybody kind of is walking around with all their own stuff. And, that's where I mean, like, if we're really trying to be overly cautious all the time, I'm not sure that that's necessarily doing a service to ourselves or others, right? So, I mean, I remember when I felt like content warning and trigger warning was like all I ever saw on any social media, which is, I mean, anything can trigger anyone. So that kind of becomes like challenging, right? So I do feel like a softening a little bit around, it being more related to deeper communication, right? Where it's like, hey, like even me kind of saying to the folks in that meetup, like, oh, I might you consider a different languaging around using Stalker, for example, and how that there may have been someone in there that was so relieved by that. We will never know. And I don't need to know. Right. But that's, I think kind of having a trauma informed experience isn't about perfectionism. Right.
That's important to say. Yeah. Because I think we can really, in our quest to be kind and compassionate, end up causing ourselves intense anxiety and even harm by trying to overly censor ourselves. So really it's just about being mindful at the end of the day.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, it's funny that we're talking about this because I pulled another card from this deck when we were pulling, and it is a major and it does have a different name, and it's the Judgment card, but they've changed the name to Assessment, which I thought was really provoking. That. Yeah. I feel like that's kind of what that is. Yeah. And I've seen other folks change Judgment specifically to things like Awakening, which I also really love. That's what it is in the Slow Holler deck. It's Awakening, which I also find really incredible. It's like pulling that blindfold off, right? And to me, this really, like, this assessment piece, this awakening piece is that, when we're in the midst of really intense, like, social change, it's easy to judge ourselves constantly. Like, oh, I'm saying the wrong thing. Or, I, like you said, just get really kind of hypervigilant and anxious. Whereas it's like going back and taking an assessment, like, am I living in alignment with my values when I can? And am I open to sort of being called in and inviting other folks' experiences with the language I've chosen to be a learning, a place to learn and grow, a place to really expand.
Yeah, I love the use of the word assessment, and even beyond just this social implications or from a like societal standpoint, just turning that like inward on yourself, I think is really important. And this is influenced from a conversation I had earlier today, but we were talking about like values and how values shift. And,
absolutely.
So pulling that card and seeing assessment is important because I feel like we can become so stuck in certain ways of being and forget that we're allowed to reassess where we are in life or reassess how we feel about something or what's important to us, because what was important 5 years ago might not be important anymore. So to see assessment versus judgment, I think is huge, because judgment has this inherent feeling of, or could have this inherent feeling of guilt or shame attached to it. Whereas assessment is more open and more neutral. Like there's not necessarily any sort of attachment to it that the word judgment I think has.
It almost feels more practical to sort of assess, right? Than judge. Like
absolutely.
And the little one tiny snippet of this guidebook around this assessment says the scene of assessment is an examination of each fool's imprint and impact on the world. Which I was like, oh, I love this because it's super close to the end of the fool's journey, as we know. And it is when we're choosing to take a look at how it went, right? Like what things would I have changed? What things might I do differently when I take the next leap, right? And go through that kind of portal of the world card. It's like, wow. I mean, I love this kind of assessment of how things went, right? Without judgment, truly.
Yeah. And even, of course, it may be coming more towards the end. I feel like if you pull that card in the beginning of something, it's okay too, because it almost acts as like a pretest. Remember those days, like in school, we take like pre-tests and post-tests. Like, here's a pre-assessment.
Oh my God.
Where am I at right now? Where do I want to be?
And that's the thing about assessment is like, it's like you said, sort of more neutral, right? Less kind of urgent, which is really nice.
So I love that we're talking about kind of like, it's interesting. We started out with quartz and then you brought up a major. So I pulled, I was like, let me see what comes out. And I pulled 4 of daggers, which would be, of course, 4 of swords. And daggers is a typically maybe common alternative that you see in tarot. And I really want to have a conversation with you about this because I personally don't like the word daggers instead of swords. It feels like, for me, I immediately get tensed. I avoid decks that have the word that change sword to dagger.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I know I do. And I was really bummed that this deck did that, because overall I like the deck. But I don't know. I just have this personal reaction to it. And, I'm sure some other folks do too. But it's what's interesting about the 4 of daggers is 4 of swords would traditionally represent this, rest and recuperation, taking a step back, this more like gentle reflection. But in this card, the imagery is interesting because the 3 daggers are above the person laying, which is, traditional. And then the 4th dagger, it's like, it looks like maybe it would be under the mattress or like right next to the bed. God. I know. It's like so not relaxing. It's like, all right.
It's like the weapon.
Yes.
Like hiding a weapon under your bed. Interesting.
Right. Like now it's like, oh shit, I'm actually not safe and I need to be able to grab this dagger, at a moment's notice. So I don't know. How do you react when you see the word dagger? Maybe it's just a me thing.
I mean, and that's, you know what? And I love that you're saying that, because that's, again, like, who knows what words trigger who.
Yeah.
Right. So I feel like that's just important to know, because it's, it could be totally harmless to someone and then someone else can have a really visceral reaction. And again, it's like, we don't need to be hyper vigilant. We just need to be open, right? To like hearing feedback. So as far as dagger, I don't know. I mean, when I first hear of that, I think it feels like dated.
Yeah.
Somehow, but also like so is swords. So in a different way.
That's true.
It's interesting. I mean, it doesn't necessarily bug me as far as like personally, but it does feel not, I don't know. I mean, I think there's something about the sort of even length of the sword that gives you some space, right?
Yes.
Just as a weapon, it gives you a little more space.
Yeah.
Whereas a dagger as a weapon is, I mean, it's very close quarters. It's a very intense situation. So it just feels even all pointed, like all sharp. I don't know. Like,
like I like your use of the word space. Well, and 2, personally, when I think of swords, I don't necessarily think of like violence or aggression, especially in the traditional imagery.
Right.
It feels like a sport because like, you know,
yes.
and I think of like LARPing, you know, like when people are role playing, they're like cosplaying swords or like, I think of D&D, but I don't know. The daggers just feel like so like, ooh, this is dangerous. I feel like it totally changes the whole suit for me when I see daggers.
Yeah. I mean, I can see that because it is a lot more like stabbing, right? I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
It's pointed, literally, and almost confronting, right? Yeah. Like I can see how, you know, again, like doesn't necessarily bother me personally, but I can totally see and also empathize with how it might just be like, nope. And, you know, and I'm kind of the person, like I have many a deck and there can be one image in like, you know, just kind of diverting from language a little bit, but if there's one image in it that hits me wrong, it's like I can't with the deck. Like, yeah. So I totally get that. It's interesting too because the slow holler deck, to keep coming back to this because it is so magical. We'll get into a couple more. I think we should just kind of toss out a couple more of the changes in the majors because there are quite a few. But they changed the suit of swords to knives. Does that strike you in the same way that daggers does? Because I just wonder.
That's interesting. Now, I don't have that initial reaction that I do to daggers. I think because like knives can also, even though they can and are a weapon, I just like think of cooking.
Absolutely. Before you said that, it's like I read your mind. That was so funny. I'm like, right. They are not strictly used for weaponry. Right. And I think that might be, and I feel like swords aren't either, right? Like they were displayed, they were used as more of a like symbol of power even.
Or an art form. Like if anyone watches Forged in Fire, you know, like,
right?
Yeah.
So I can see how dagger specifically almost feels like it's almost like weaponizing.
Yeah.
That whole suit, which it's already kind of pokey. So no need for that.
Right. Yeah. Too aggressive.
Yes. I get that. So I'm glad we talked that out. But yeah, it's interesting. This one changed to knives and that it doesn't really hit you in that way.
No.
But a couple other super interesting kind of major changes. There's so many, but we'll just pick a couple. One of them is the Emperor.
Yes, please talk about this.
They changed this card to the Navigator, which is just so different than when you think about the Emperor, right? It's not like, first of all, it also very much ungenders the card, which is great. I think anytime that can happen, it's great. I think it can definitely open up a whole new meaning. But also the Navigator can be a person. And again, they can be any person. You know, they are still a person who takes the lead, right? They're navigating.
I'm so glad you brought this up. And this is the slow holler deck, right?
It is the slow holler deck.
I remember because we had a conversation a couple weeks ago and you were talking about that particular card. And I was so excited about it because it again kind of like fueled this conversation about language, because I feel like the Emperor in general is this card that a lot of people have a really complicated relationship with. And I think that maybe it's the imagery, but personally, I think it is more of the language because, I mean, even thinking about the traditional meaning behind the card, to hear the word navigator, it does make me think about maybe someone either holding a map with a team behind them with like, you know, their explorers, or someone, you know, maybe steering a ship, but they have their crew with them and they can't steer the ship without the crew. So there's there's a hierarchy. There's someone maybe quote unquote in charge, but it's more of a leadership role versus an authoritarian or boss like type role where I know what's best, do what I say. Navigator just maybe softens and adds a little bit more collaboration to the card.
Where
I
it's
feel
almost, I feel like it's almost more about accessing your skills and expertise than it is overpowering others because you simply claim that you know more, or even have been given sort of a title that people are supposed to assume that you know more, right?
Right.
That's not always true, right? I mean, a navigator is part of the team. It's not the team. and just like, I sometimes think of boss, like you said, like a boss, right? When we think of emperor, and that's also part of the team. It's not the whole thing. If there weren't other people involved, they wouldn't even have that title, right? So like you said, having that so the imagery on this card, I just have to mention, you talked about a ship. It is like is it the bow? Is that the front of a ship?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Maybe.
Or the stern. I don't know. I'm not a ship person. I live in Colorado.
Ship experts, please let us know.
Please do. Bow, stern. I feel like bow. Anyway, it's the front. It looks like the front. And what's really beautiful about it is that there's no people in this image. It's just kind of these dotted lines and mapping of the stars. Ooh. So I love this even more because it almost feels like this isn't even about the person holding the map. It's about the person trusting the stars, right?
Yeah, or like the map itself.
Exactly.
Because and it's interesting because the Emperor in the Rainbow Moon Tarot, I'm so bummed, but they used the word authoritarian as the
my
Emperor.
gosh, that's a big that's a totally opposite change, right? Like
right.
Whoa.
I know, and I'm bummed about it, but but I get it, but I feel like, I don't know, authoritarianism is basically when there's this power structure where one person or even a group of people does have this authority or control over everyone else, which is kind of how I think a lot of folks feel about the Emperor in general. So in this case, I feel like maybe this use of language made the Emperor worse.
Right. Or like it feels less expansive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of the beauty of, and this just, and no shade to the people who created that deck. I don't know who it is, but I do feel like there is also can be a tendency to change the names arbitrarily. And I don't know what the guidebook says or if there's, but you could dig deeper with that. But I do feel like there's the decks that I pulled out here, the changes that they made seem very intentional, that they be expansive and not just kind of swapping one word for another so that it sounds fancier. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that it really has a deeper meaning. And that's something about the language of this deck that really kind of blows me away. And I mean, another one in the majors that I feel like is worth talking about is the Hanged Man or the Hanged One. They've changed it to the Precipice.
Ooh.
And I sort of always want that card to have a different name.
Yeah, same.
In every single deck. So any deck that changes it, I'm kind of on board.
Yeah,
but this is like wild because a precipice is like the edge of a cliff. I mean, it's like so different, right? Then it's about how sometimes when we're, kind of hanging on, we aren't able to change our perspective, right? Like, so looking over and expanding and seeing like kind of all the possibility. I mean, it almost kind of has Fool vibes, but
right. That's what I thought.
But the precipice is just such a completely different take, right? It feels very intentional, very different. And I also love that it changes the name of that particular card. All of the above.
And being on the edge too, I do feel like it's appropriate for that because, the Hanged Man or the Hanged One is all about like shifting perspective. So for, being, the precipice, it's being almost ready to grab a hold of something different or have a new idea or a new experience or a new way of thinking or being. So, and, in the Hanged One, they're hanging upside down. It's not necessarily a comfortable place to be. And, precipice is, usually be on the edge of something.
Sure. On the cliff's edge is also not that comfortable, right?
Kind of dangerous.
You're definitely changing the way you're thinking about things.
Absolutely.
And then I have to just mention another, just since we're on the Hanged Man and Hanged One languaging and how that feels dated and strange. And I don't even want to get into that, but I have another deck here that I just absolutely love. It's called Future Ancestor Tarot. It is glorious. It's one of my absolute most gentle, most favorite decks that I own. It's by Alexa Luna, and they changed the Hanged One to Metamorphosis, which is also brilliant.
Love that.
It's like the goo, right? Like the total unknown before the next action, right? Where it's like, I know I'm becoming something, but I don't know what. And right now I feel like nothing. So
Absolutely. And you saying metamorphosis.
So provocative.
Yeah. And using the word metamorphosis automatically makes me think of a butterfly. Even
Absolutely.
as cliche as that is. It's like, because they're usually hanging on to something, and it's that liminal stage of, not necessarily being what you were before, but not quite being what you're going to be. And that's so appropriate for the Hanged One.
Agreed. I feel like that's exactly what that archetype is inviting us to explore and examine. So changing it to something like that it just expands for me, and feels still in the realm of, right? We still are in that kind of unknown, the process of changing, not being changed necessarily, but that kind of suspended time frame where it's like, oh, we don't know, but also there's something, it alludes to something coming, right? And I think that's kind of the difference between the Hanged Man. That doesn't necessarily allude to something changing in just the language alone.
Right. I feel like everything you're saying is really just driving home this idea that language is and will continue to evolve and adapt, or we will adapt to over time. And that it's really all about like reflecting and changing perspectives and being curious and exploring new interpretations based on different words and language and, different contexts. So yeah, I feel like it's really important for all of us to continue to just be curious and open about that.
Oh yeah. That feels like, we touched on this sort of expansiveness, and I feel like that is the access point, right? The page, or whatever people change it to,
right?
Because that language is also kind of like, what? What's a page?
Right.
But for me, it's become like the student. And what's interesting is in the Outsider Tarot, it's the spark. So the pages are called the sparks, and I feel like that is just such a great approach and perspective, right? It's like those little sparks, those little ideas, those things that get you feeling more curious and full of wonder than sort of anything else.
I love that. It makes me want to be super cliche and say that I hope that this conversation has sparked something for listeners.
Yes, I love that. I mean, how can it not? I feel like, language talking, I mean, that's how we communicate. So it's so multi-layered and multifaceted and just full of little nuggets, little sparks, little things that really kind of get us going. I mean, to me, that's that page energy, that spark energy where it's like, ooh, a new idea.
Absolutely. So if you want to learn more about Erin and her offerings, check out the show notes because she has some great stuff to offer you. And I just love her brain.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. I could talk to you all day about language.
I know, me too. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok under the handle @TheTarotDiagnosis and join us while we pull daily cards and explore tarot and mental health in between podcast episodes. You can also subscribe to our podcast to make sure that you never miss an episode. If you have a topic or question that you'd like for us to explore on the podcast, you can contact us directly on our website, www.thetarotdiagnosis.com.